the NCAA might be falling off more than one way in one particular fashion. This is the NCAA potentially falling on multiple fronts. Now, if you haven't been living under a rock, we've seen throughout what some people like to throw the O word out. I don't use that over here. If you're looking for that O word to be utilized, you can go to a different channel to go ahead and do that. But we don't do that over here. At least I don't, right? What I've seen is many of these negotiations on the college football playoff. Many of you know we're going from a 4 to 12 team format. Now, there's more discussions after a few years of the 12 team format to extend it out to 14 teams. Well, not only are we possibly seeing 14 teams in college football playoff next time it does expand, 14 being an odd number, but that's besides the point. There's also a suggestion of the winner of the SEC and the winner of the Big Ten Conference getting a automatic, not an automatic bid, no, not just that, but an automatic bye, and no other conference getting that. All the other conferences would need to play in the first round. SEC champion and the Big Ten champion would automatically get a chance to be in the quarterfinals of the college football playoff. Well, there was quite a bit of pushback, but it makes you wonder if there is a point where the SEC and the Big Ten, they're looking across their counterparts at the table saying that we tried to negotiate with y'all in good faith. It's not really good faith, but try to negotiate with y'all. And they end up going and forming their own Super League. They break away from the NCAA. And so, under that scenario, Andy Staples and Cole Klubnik actually got together and kind of talked this hypothetical through. What if the SEC and the Big Ten actually broke away from the NCAA? What could that possibly look like? So, what we ended up finding is we get this graphic from On Free Sports, and it has the College Football Super League, hypothetical, of course. And what we had was two super conferences of 24 teams each. Now, my very first reaction when I saw this was that I absolutely hated it. I actually think, like the sky is falling in terms of college football. It's not that I'm afraid of change. I'm not afraid of change at all. I am, however, afraid of change that is going to be detrimental to the overall game of college football, because just because you're making more money doesn't mean your product is better. The NFL, for example, is making more money than it has ever before, but the NFL product, on the other hand, that particular product has not necessarily improved in all aspects. Some would argue that certain aspects of the NFL has gotten worse, officiating always being a hot button discussion. So that was my first reaction, because I don't want to see the SEC and the Big Ten break away from the rest of the FBS, because those two conferences in particular, you can't tell the overarching college football story without those two conferences. And then I dug a little bit deeper into what those teams would be included in this hypothetical college football super league. And while I still wasn't a fan of it necessarily, it's not as bad as what I thought it was going to be. Now, let me go ahead and explain real fast. So, how it has it broken out is that the SEC and the Big Ten, they would be two super conferences. You would have two conferences of 24 teams, so you would have 48 teams total. And I'm sure through those 48 teams, they would have their own playoff system, their own rewards, yada, yada, yada. But I'm looking through this graphic that was put out by On Free Sports, and honestly, the vast majority of Power 4 teams would be included in this. So it would, in a sense, create a clean break between the Power 4 and what we have under the Group of 5 structure. Now, it's not a completely clean break. There would be a few Power Four teams that would be left behind. Certainly, the West Coast would be grossly what's the word I'm looking for? Underrepresented under this Super League hypothetical. You only have 5 teams west of Texas in the Super League. So essentially, the entirety of the West Coast, with the exception of a few markets, would be cut off and brought out. But two surprising benefits that I think would come out of it is that, well, one, when we're talking about the national championship, just for the overall FBS version of college football, you have 134 teams that are in this same FBS division. But even though it may seem on paper, well, all 134 teams have a chance to win a national championship, that really isn't the case now, is it? If we're truly being honest with ourselves, in any given year, and this is us kind of being generous, there's really only 15 to 20 teams out there at the start of any given season that have any sort of realistic chance to not just compete for a college football playoff championship, but you're also talking about just getting into the original 14 playoff format. So you're really only looking at 15 to 20 teams that have an actual chance and maybe have those expectations where, they want to be in the college football playoff at the end of the year. They want to compete for a national championship. But for the majority of teams that are at the FBS level, that's not a realistic expectation. Many of the teams out there would be happy if, they just improved upon what they did on the previous season. They would be happy if they would make it into bowl season and play in some of the non-New Year's Six bowl games that are taking place every winter during, the Christmas holiday season. That's the reality for many of these programs, and that's particularly the case for the group of 5. And it leads me to the other thing that I thought about in the group of 5. If you end up having this breakaway, you could create something that I know many fans, particularly down at the group of 5, would want in the first place. And that would be having your own group of 5 playoff. Now, I first heard this over on the Late Kick Show with Josh Pate, and he worded it pretty well. I don't know exactly how he said it, but the general idea was, okay, if you have like a 2021 Cincinnati, for example, that is truly good enough to be in your Final Four, they could participate in your college football playoff for, the FBS National Championship. But there's other group of 5 teams that have had spectacular seasons, but have not had the opportunity to go and play for that college football playoff, for that national championship. 2017 UCF is certainly one of the most notable cases during this college football playoff era. Liberty, probably some of those Liberty fans might feel the same way about how they had this undefeated season. They ended up winning the Conference USA, and yet they weren't even remotely close to being in that top 4. I don't think they were even ranked by the College Football Playoff Committee until either after conference weekend or after the end of the regular season. So for many group of 5 teams, there's no path for them to be able to actually be in a position to compete for a college football playoff national championship. So for those teams, 2017 UCF, 2023 Liberty being 2 more recent examples, you could have your very own group of 5 playoff where you have, your four teams or however many teams you want to put in there. What you end up doing down there is, none of my business. I don't get to make any of those particular decisions, but the group of 5 can have their own playoff. And even if we never get to a point where we see a college football super league created, we never get to a point to where the SEC and the Big Ten completely breaks away from the NCAA and from the FBS structure, I still don't think, even though we are expanding to 12 teams and expanding out to 14 teams, I think the group of five having their own playoff still isn't that bad of an idea. Even with the 12 teams getting in, yes, there is a path for now at least one group of five teams to get in, thanks to the auto bid system. The auto bid system is of course, a discussion for another time. We're talking about over 60 teams essentially fighting for one spot. The only other way that you could see a group of five team get to a point where they could get in as an at-large is if, they do end up finishing undefeated or 11-1, but you can't just do that for one season. You have to have that type of high-level performance, and also you have to have that high-level performance for multiple years, at least 2 years. And then also in the year that you make that kind of run, you have to challenge yourself in non-conference play. That was exactly how Cincinnati was able to get into that college football playoff back in 2021. Back in 2020, they did end up going undefeated. They were invited to the Peach Bowl to play Georgia. And while Georgia ended up winning on a 50-yard field goal to end the game, Cincinnati was very much in a position to win the Peach Bowl against the Georgia Bulldogs. They had a legitimate opportunity to win that game. So they finished undefeated. They won the American, and they didn't win, but they had a competitive performance against Georgia. That was the backdrop leading into 2021. So Cincinnati was already on the radar at that time going into the 2021 season. Then in the 2021 season, they went undefeated again, but then they went and played Notre Dame on the road, Notre Dame finishing as a top 10 team in their own right that year, and they beat them on the road. And then they did what they were supposed to do in conference play. They won the American, they went undefeated. That was how Cincinnati got into the playoff. So, as you can see, when you're a group of five team and you're trying to do that for 2 years in a row, essentially go undefeated in the regular season for 2 years in a row, that's almost impossible to do. And it's even harder to do with what we have with the transfer portal, where your roster can legitimately be rated at any given moment, where some of your better group of five players, if they don't leave for the NFL, they end up going and transferring to bigger programs in what used to be the Power 5 going into the Power 4. So, unfortunately for the group of five, is it possible in the 12-team format that they would go and play and have a legitimate shot at national championship? Sure. But it's going to be harder to do that because, instead of trying to out-scheme your opponents for 2 games, you're likely going to have to do it for 4. And that's a harder task. So, even if the Super League doesn't happen, I would absolutely love to see a similar playoff format just for the group of five. And it would also be fun to see for the group of five fans if they can decide on the field who is truly the best group of five program out there. Because while Liberty was the highest ranked group of five team, at least in terms of what the College Football Playoff Committee said at the end of conference weekend, there's some other programs out there that, had some legitimate arguments. SMU, for example, James Madison being another one as well. It's an interesting thought experiment. And if we do have changes to the playoff, I would love to see a group of five playoff. Now, granted, if you make it to the top 12 of the bigger one, the group of five teams should go there. But for most of G5, that's not a realistic possibility. G5 playoff wouldn't be such a bad idea either.